Hello, Cenk. I think it's about time you and I had a little chat. I've noticed for a while now that your set is similar to a news studio, so I thought I'd provide you with a video that has a setting that is to your comfort. I sewed my head onto this man for precisely this purpose. Your video is 10 minutes long, and I'm going to go through the entire thing, point by point, and no moss-covered stone will be left unturned. It is very strange to me that your title is The History of the Second Amendment, considering what the content of your video actually is, but we'll get there. Anyone who has followed my channel for a decent amount of time knows I advocate for the Second Amendment being retained in its current form, that being a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I will detail my case here as concisely as I can, and then we can move on to Cenk. The United States was founded on a system that prioritizes the separation of power. That is why we have three separate branches of government, one being the legislative, which writes the law, the executive, which enforces the law, and the judiciary, which judges the constitutionality of laws passed. Here's the way the system of checks and balances works. The legislative branch has the power to write the laws. They have a very strong power, and so that must be checked by the head executive, being the president. The president may veto a bill that passed through Congress because no law is passed without the president's signature. However, if a law does get through and a case comes forward to the judiciary detailing how the law is inconsistent with our Constitution, then the judiciary may strike that law down even after the president's approval, and that is the final word on the law within the system. However, what if a bill gets through that would jail people who criticize the government? What if it is signed into law by the president? And what if it was then deemed constitutional by the judiciary? That is when the citizens would bear their arms, march on Washington, hopefully, and say, "Screw you, government, I am free." This is definitely preferable to being denied a weapon and being forced to march on Washington, which is now oppressing you with nothing but a smile and a shoe shine. This most likely will not happen, but in case it does, there's a provision in the Constitution that prevents them from taking away my ability to do that, as well as has the added benefit of allowing me to protect my home from potential violent invaders. Now, some of you may say, what if they pass a law banning all guns? Well, the same standards apply, and the people would not abide by that law and retain their weapons. This is how the Revolutionary War started in Lexington and Concord. Enough out of me. Take it away, Cenk.
So I was tipped off to this story initially by Kyle Kulinski, who does a great show on our network, Secular Talk. You should check it out. My old friend Tom Hartman, we used to do radio together back in the day, wrote a really interesting article about the origins of the Second Amendment. Now, let's acknowledge in the beginning that, of course, history is always nuanced, and there are many different components that go into any one thing, including the Second Amendment.
I absolutely agree that history is nuanced and there are a multitude of causes to certain effects, but I am also aware that there is a truth to what happened. We can debate about the causes of something, but what actually occurred is not something we can obfuscate with nuance.
And how it came to be. So people do make legitimate points about how there was the English Bill of Rights, and they talked about the need for arms. They didn't want the king to have all the arms. Well, that would create a political problem for them, especially among the different religions that quite often went to war in England.
Cenk is speaking about the provision in the English Bill of Rights of 1689, which states, "Protestant subjects may have arms for their defense as suitable to their class and as allowed by law." I'm sure we can all see the inherent differences within how this law could be interpreted. It only applies to Protestant subjects. There is the restriction suitable to their class and as allowed by law. People of different classes may or may not be allowed certain arms. The fact that it says, "and as allowed by law," doesn't guarantee anything. It only guarantees arms to Protestant subjects, provided they don't write another law banning the owning of certain kinds of weapons, up to and including every available weapon.
We didn't have similar religious problems, but we did have issues between the North and the South and other ones here in the United States. And it talks, of course, the Second Amendment does, about a well-regulated militia.
It does mention a well-regulated militia. That is contained within the prefatory clause of the Second Amendment. It is giving a reason for the amendment being put into place. The prefatory clause details nothing of what the amendment restricts the government from doing. If you merely had a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, full stop, the law would tell you nothing. The law serves no function. It's just there. It's a sentence that neither restricts nor provides anything. It isn't even a sentence. It's a fragment of a sentence. We'll get to the operative clause of the amendment later. That must be part of the reason they are called those two things. One portion prefaces the actual law, and the other operates it.
And there were militias in the North as well as the South. But the militias in the South also had a different name. They were called slave patrols. Interesting.
Oh no, please. Don't tell me you're going to try and turn the debate about gun control into a race issue. Is that what you're going to try and do, Cenk? Anyway, a little background on slave patrols. Slave patrols began in 1704 in South Carolina, before the Constitution was in effect, and before the United States was even independent from Britain. In the simplest terms I can, they were there to quash slave rebellions, prevent slaves from escaping, and enact punishments on slaves misbehaving, quote-unquote. Obviously not a very moral thing to be doing, but let's let Cenk tell us what this has to do with the Second Amendment.
So, we're going to get to that in a second. First, let me read you what the Second Amendment says. It says, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, today, modern conservatives interpret that as everybody gets to have any weapon they like, pretty much. And the Supreme Court has gone along with that interpretation.
Please name the conservatives who are saying people should have any weapon they like. Name these people, because I haven't seen one of them. Maybe I'm just hanging around the wrong people. The Supreme Court has not gone along with that interpretation. People should be able to have any weapon they like. The most recent decision along those lines is the Heller decision, part of which reads, quote, like most rights, the Second Amendment right is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever in any manner whatsoever and for whatever purpose. For example, concealed weapons prohibitions have been upheld under the amendment or state analogs. The court's opinion should not be taken to cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places, such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. Miller's holding that the sorts of weapons protected are those in the common use at the time finds support in the historical tradition of prohibiting the carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons. That certainly doesn't sound like anyone can own any kind of weapon they want, Cenk.
Now, the reality is, the first part of the amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary. So that is a very important qualifier because back then they had militias and they didn't want the United States government to take over all of the militias that they had. The point was militias, not, hey, Bob down the street gets to have any weapon he likes. They've forgotten that. They get very angry when you point that out. They claim to be strict constructionists. When you actually read the amendment back to them, their heads explode. Okay.
My head certainly hasn't exploded. For anyone who wants to use this video as a source of hypocrisy regarding a previous video of mine, I've recently been given an education on how allowing the court to play the definition game willy-nilly is unfavorable. If there's anything I value, it's learning. But here we go. Cenk, you failed to detail the operative clause of the amendment. You claim that our heads explode when confronted with the actual amendment. You are implying that we don't understand what the amendment actually means. You have yet to detail what the operative clause allows. You've read it, but you haven't described what it means yet, probably because it cuts against you. Anyhow, I'll detail the operative clause to you now. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. To my knowledge, Bob down the street is a member of the people, so it's clear that his right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. You, however, seem to think that the prefatory clause qualifies that in some way, as if it is only a right of the militia to keep and bear arms. Well, let's examine another amendment with the term the people in it. The First Amendment prohibits Congress from making a law abridging the right of the people to peaceably assemble. I'm sure you wouldn't argue that Bob down the street isn't a member of the press, which is mentioned previously in the First Amendment, so he actually doesn't have the right to peaceably assemble. The Constitution mentions the people in the Fourth Amendment as well. It also mentions the people in the Ninth and Tenth Amendments. All of those restrictions of government action on the people includes Bob down the street. Cenk. If the framers didn't want Bob down the street to be able to own a firearm, they would have written the militia in place of the people. Actually, in Heller, the court decided that in all 6 other provisions of the Constitution that mentions the people, the term unambiguously refers to all law-abiding members of the political community, not an unspecified subset. You may agree or disagree with this definition of the people decided by the court, but it still stands that the people does not refer to the militia in particular in the Second Amendment. The people includes Bob down the street. The amendment does not restrict the right to the militia, unless your fictional Bob is a convicted felon, but I'm guessing that you used that example to refer to the average law-abiding American citizen. Let me see if I can reword a right in a similar manner to the Second Amendment. A free press being necessary for the criticism of the government, the right of the people to express themselves freely shall not be infringed. Your argument should apply here as well, and the right to freely express yourself should be limited to members of the press. But it seems, Cenk, that you have the ability to conveniently stop understanding the English language in order to argue your point. If you can look at this hypothetical law and claim that it restricts the freedom of expression to the press, it simply shows that you do not understand English. Then you claim that your opponents can't understand language when you read them the Second Amendment. I'm sorry, Cenk, that isn't me in the mirror. It's you.
So militia is the first part. The second part, they say there, is being necessary to the security of a free state. Now that's very interesting, because as Hartman points out, it originally did not say that. It had the word country instead of state. Let me show you the first draft of the Second Amendment by James Madison. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country, but no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. So that was the entirety of the first draft of the Second Amendment. They changed the word country to state after significant debate on the issue, because they said, no, the point is for the states to be able to protect themselves. Not the people in the states, not individuals, for the states to protect themselves against the United States of America. Whoa, okay, now that's a totally different interpretation than what we have today.
Whoa, I really hoped you'd address the problem with the whole the people thing, but you won't. And anyway, the first draft of an amendment has no bearing on the final draft. There was a very rigorous debate about the issue, and since there was going to be a centralized national government, the states wanted the ability to defend themselves against it if it ever went tyrannical. Very good, Cenk. Let's see if this ray of sunshine lasts.
We say, no, it doesn't mean states, it doesn't mean militia. It just means, well, I get to have a gun, I get to have a gun. We all get to have guns.
Nope, I guess not. Cenk, just relax and come give me a hug. Everything is gonna be okay.
No, it doesn't say that.
You're right. It doesn't say, oh, I get to have a gun, I get to have a gun, we all get to have guns. But it does say that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and since law-abiding private citizens are included in the people, then yeah, they get to have guns. Provided there are some stipulations to that, as I've mentioned previously, felons, mentally ill, not to include all of the regulation, but that is indeed what it says.
It says in order for a state to protect itself, it must have a well-regulated militia who must be armed, because if the militia isn't armed, well, then it can't protect itself.
Holy fucking shit, Cenk, the people! Sorry to have to repeat myself here, but he acts like that clause doesn't even exist, or that it isn't as important as the prefatory clause.
So let's go to Patrick Henry. Now, Patrick Henry was in principle opposed to slavery, but in reality, not opposed to slavery. He wanted to have it continue for practical reasons. I don't know how you split that, baby.
It's pretty easy. It's called a necessary evil. Not to say that I support Patrick Henry's opinion on whether slavery was a necessary evil or not. It's just pretty easy to split that baby.
But here's how he did so for the purpose of the Second Amendment. In the debates, when they were arguing over this issue, he said, let me here call your attention to that part, Article 1, Section 8 of the proposed Constitution, which allowed the United States to have an army, which gives the Congress power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such a part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States. By this, sir, you see that their control over our last and best defense is unlimited. If they neglect or refuse to discipline or arm our militia, they will be useless. The states can do neither, this power being exclusively given to Congress. The power of appointing officers over men not disciplined or armed is ridiculous, so that this pretended little remains of power left to the states may, at the pleasure of Congress, be rendered negatory. So he's saying, if you say that the United States Congress can organize an army or a national militia and they can arm it, and then you allow them the right to unarm our state militias, well, then our state militias become pointless. Our state militias must be armed.
And since they must be armed, we'll write an amendment that prevents the government from infringing on the people's right to keep and bear arms. Notice the difference between the reasoning for an amendment and the actual function.
For two reasons. One is to have a defense against the United States of America, and two, so that we could have our slave patrols. That is what the militia in the South was predominantly used for. In fact, the first militias in America were started to put down slave rebellions. Like I said, there were militias in the North, and for example, George Washington had to put down a bit of a rebellion started by a militia in Pennsylvania. It was about militias.
You can assert this over and over and over again, and scream and yell and flail around, but you still have not addressed two little pesky words in that amendment. I'll let the audience decide what those are. Saying the word militia and slave over and over and over again doesn't change that fact.
Okay. Now, in the South, though, they had this issue. Now, George Mason, another founding father, another slaveholder, he had 300 slaves, wrote this. Look, the militia may be here destroyed by the method which has been practiced in other parts of the world before. That is, by rendering them useless, by disarming them. Under various pretenses, Congress may neglect to provide for arming and disciplining the militia, and the state governments cannot do it, for Congress has an exclusive right to arm them under this proposed Constitution.
No mention of slaves in there. Not one. Just a dispute over the fact that Congress had exclusive power over the militias of all of the states. Not just the South, Cenk, but all of them. Just had to bring up that he owned slaves, though. I don't mind it. It's true. But this is my personal opinion. It seems to me like you're trying to draw together the horrifying nature of slavery and the writing of the Second Amendment, as if to stir up some vague notion that anyone who supports the Second Amendment in its current form also has to have no problem with slave rebellions getting quashed, and it's really fucking disingenuous. Mason didn't mention slaves once in that quotation. He was explaining that he wasn't comfortable with the Congress having exclusive power to arm state militias. But alas, I repeat myself. George Mason actually opposed slavery in his speeches, but never freed his slaves, so take that for what it is. He inherited his approximately 300 slaves from his father. Actions do speak louder than words, but here is another quote from George Mason, who called slave trading that infernal traffic. Slavery discourages arts and manufactures. The poor despise labor when performed by slaves. They prevent the immigration of whites who really enrich and strengthen a country. They produce the most pernicious effect on manners. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. Providence punishes national sins by national calamities. So, where do we go from here, Cenk?
So what they're saying is the Constitution says that you can have a federal army, but you can disarm the state militias. Well, we need an amendment to fix that. It's a very important amendment because it is going to protect not only states, but the South in particular.
Not the South in particular, but all of the states. Mason didn't mention the South in particular or anything to that effect in that quotation. You, Cenk, are the one who made that jump.
Okay? Why? Because it gets to the issue of slavery. So now Patrick Henry discusses that head on. He says, if the country be invaded, a state may go to war, but cannot suppress slave insurrections under this new Constitution.
Notice how he puts the most extreme emphasis on the word they fucking added into that quote.
If there should happen an insurrection of slaves, the country cannot be said to be invaded. They cannot therefore suppress it without the interposition of Congress. Congress and Congress only under this new Constitution can call forth the militia. In other words, I need to be able to call forth my militia to suppress a slave rebellion. What if the United States, the northern states, get more power, there's a slave rebellion, and they don't call forth the militia or the slave patrols to put it down? Well, then the slaves will overthrow us. And we can't have that, and the southern states will not agree. Unless you put the Second Amendment in, protecting our militias that do slave patrols, we're not in. You need to put that amendment into the Constitution. Otherwise, the North can do two things: get rid of our militias and let our slaves run wild. Or, as he alludes to here, they can actually conscript the slaves and thereby free them. And we can't have that. Fascinating.
Yes, the opinion of one person in the debates regarding the Second Amendment is fascinating. You'll see why I even interjected that later on in the video.
So he continues, in this state there are 236,000 blacks, and there are many in several other states. But there are few or none in northern states. May Congress not say that every black man must fight? Did we not see a little of this in the last war? He's right, in the Revolutionary War that did happen. We were not so hard pushed as to make emancipation general, but acts of assembly passed that every slave who would go to the army should be free. Oh, what if the Union decided that they're going to take all the blacks and use them as soldiers and now they're free? Can't have it. We need our slavery. We need our militia. We need our guns to protect our institution of slavery.
See what I mean? It's getting more obvious that he's trying to connect those two ideas. Notice how he says, we need our slavery, we need our militia, we need our guns. He wants to make you think that if you support the Second Amendment, you also, in some minuscule fashion, support slavery, or support the rebellions of those slaves getting hammered down. To use Cenks' word of the day, fascinating.
I'm not the one saying it.
Technically, yes you are.
You can't go, you brown,
Wasn't planning on it. What the fuck?
It's the Founding Fathers. Are the quotes incorrect?
It's not the Founding Fathers. It's Patrick Henry. One guy. One. This is why I interjected earlier. George Mason didn't mention slaves at all, if you remember correctly. And technically one of the quotes was incorrect, because you put slave in a spot where it didn't originally reside, and wasn't needed to clarify what Patrick Henry meant, and you decided to put the most emphasis on it. To mislead people.
This is why they asked for the Second Amendment.
And by they, he means Patrick Henry.
Address the facts of the matter. You're not going to. You're going to say, there are other factors. But I know there are other factors. But this was also a factor. It was a giant factor. I'm not saying it. They said it.
It was a giant factor. And we only displayed to you one quote by Patrick Henry that mentioned it. Fascinating.
All right, one more. At the time, manumission was what they called the idea that the Constitution could be used to free the slaves. And here's what Patrick Henry said.
Why am I not fucking surprised?
They will search that paper, referring to the Constitution, and see if they have the power of manumission. And have they not, sir? Have they not the power to provide for the general defense and welfare? May they not think that these call for the abolition of slavery? May they not pronounce all slaves free? And will they not be warranted by that power? This is no ambiguous implication or logical deduction. The paper speaks to the point. They have the power in clear, unequivocal terms, and will clearly and certainly exercise it. See, this is not a minor issue when we were founding the country, and you can't just close your eyes and pretend not to see it.
And you can't just display quotes from Patrick Henry and claim the Founding Fathers said it. You also can't give a quote by George Mason that mentions nothing about slavery and shoehorn it into being about slavery.
Remember, there was the famous 3/5 compromise. Slaves are not allowed to vote, but they count as 3/5 of a human being, so the South could have more votes as compared to the North.
Nothing to do with the Second Amendment.
This is an issue they discussed and debated at great length. One of the resolutions was, let's get a Second Amendment that gives the states the right to arm their militias. Now, the North will use it in any way they like, and the South will use it to make sure there are no slave rebellions. Give me that Second Amendment so I can keep my slaves in line. Now, you might say, hey, you know what? Even if that was part of the intent for some of the Founding Fathers, I love it anyway.
You say some of the Founding Fathers, but have only given us Patrick Henry quotations, one of which you had to alter, and a George Mason quote that has nothing to do with slavery. What's the matter? Couldn't find any others?
Okay, that's a position you come to. I just want you to understand the history of it so you're not confused about the context. This is the true context of the Second Amendment.
You mean this is the true context of Patrick Henry's opinions and statements regarding the Second Amendment? I have a new title for this video. Give me Patrick Henry quotes or give me death.
Now, right now we don't have slaves, so you can say, hey, you know what? That's not a legitimate part of the discussion for today's world. Okay, fair enough. But back then, they also didn't have automatic weaponry. They didn't have AR-15s.
They also didn't have computers. Or telephones. It looks like the government can now censor the press as long as it's an online publication. Who knew?
They had muskets.
Did they have anything more technologically advanced than muskets? Because the people could own those.
Right? And so in this case, you can't at the same time turn around and have the Supreme Court say, oh no, I'm looking at the context of the Second Amendment, and I see that they meant for everybody to have a gun and to have any kind of gun they like.
Does any kind of gun they like mean the same thing as within the common use at the time? Also, you have to ignore an awful lot of private citizens owning firearms back then to claim that they actually only meant the militia.
Well, that's not what they meant.
Yes, it is. Are you going to address the whole the people portion before you end this video?
And that part is incredibly clear.
Well, I guess not. Let's end with a few quotes from the Founding Fathers about the Second Amendment. George Mason, 1778. I ask, sir, what is the militia? It is the whole of the people. To disarm the people is the best and most effectual way to enslave them. Richard Henry Lee, 1788. A militia, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves, and include all men capable of bearing arms. To preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of people always possess arms. Samuel Adams, 1788. And that the said Constitution be never construed to authorize Congress to infringe the just liberty of the press, or the rights of conscience, or to prevent the people of the United States, who are peaceable citizens, from keeping their own arms. Thomas Jefferson, 1824. The constitutions of most of our states assert that all power is inherent in the people, that they may exercise it by themselves, in all cases to which they think themselves competent, as in electing their functionaries, executive and legislative, and deciding by a jury of themselves, in all judiciary cases in which any fact is involved, or they may act by representatives freely and equally chosen, that it is their right and duty to be at all times armed. Patrick Henry, 1836. The great object is that every man be armed. Everyone who is able may have a gun. Need I say more? Have a good day, everybody.